This is the delightful stage star and one of your television game-playing favorites, Arlene Francis.
A wonderful actress and a perfect wife, Arlene Francis.
Thank you, dear. Does it go around, could it go around? Well, you're wondering what I'm going to ask you, what it goes around, aren't you? Would it hit anything between the waist and the knees?
Yes. Would it hit everything between?
Miss Francis?
Miss McMahon, do young men come to you, too, as well as old men like
Wait. I disqualify Arlene's question.
Fred, I think the point is properly taken.
You know I adore you, Fred.
Oh, sure.
That's the way you are. Are they...
Isn't it pretty?
It's chiffon.
You're a vision and plan.
Oh, my, no.
That's all.
Talk to each other.
Why don't you say Arlene baby, too?
That's right, Arlene baby, I am.
Thank you.
Hello and welcome to the Lucas Alexander Show. I am Lucas Alexander and I am in Copenhagen, Denmark. And our guest today is an author, an American author who has written a fascinating new book about a cultural icon of the stage, the theater, radio, and television in America in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, Arlene Francis, known to most people from the very popular quiz game show, What's My Line, that aired from 1950 to 1967 and then went into syndication and lasted until 1975. And it's absolutely fascinating to talk about this very, very unique and very special woman that has achieved newfound fame in a way. And I think it's impossible to actually explain to the audience how famous and how known and well-loved Arlene Francis was in America in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. But there's one expert here. This is our guest today, who's written a fascinating new book, a biography on Arlene Francis called All Three Channels. Welcome to the show, Jennifer Bitman. Thank you so much for being with me, Jennifer.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Lucas. And as you said, Arlene, most of the viewers may know her from What's My Line, which was the classic American game show in the 1950s. And that's actually how I discovered her. But part of why I wanted to write this book is because there's actually so much more that she did. And a lot of people maybe don't realize that because the show ran for 25 years total, and Arlene was a panelist for the entire time. I think she started maybe with the second episode she debuted, so she was really a staple of that show. But at her core, I believe, and what I found through writing about her is that she wanted to be remembered for being a stage actress because she did so much Broadway, and as those who have watched What's My Line know, a lot of the mystery guests, which you've interviewed one, Piper Laurie, were on Broadway. They had shows running either stage or film. And so that was a big part of the allure for her, I think, is what she wanted to be remembered for. So in the book, I chronicle that as much as I can. And I hope that, your viewers and readers are interested in learning more about the Arlene Francis that did radio, that did some films even, and not just the What's My Line, although I do cover it. But I think she was a trailblazer for women and television especially, and that's something that was important. So I can tell you a little bit more about how the book became what it is.
Yes, I would love to hear a lot about how this all came to pass and why you started writing the book as well. But first of all, for viewers that may not be very familiar with Arlene, and I think especially here in this part of the world, in Europe, for example, and in my country, in Denmark, I don't think there's anybody who has any clue who she is, actually. Unless they have seen episodes of What's My Line, which is now popular on YouTube and has been for quite a number of years. So, and what I said before, she's found newfound fame in a way. I was not aware of who Arlene was, and until I saw it on YouTube, and then I started to see a lot with her and discovered what an amazing lady she was, how infatuated you get by, mesmerized you get from seeing her. It's like she's reaching out from the screen. And we're talking about shows that was recorded 60 years ago, 50, 60 years ago. And it's quite remarkable that somebody with that energy and that, let's say, soul frequency in a way can reach people today. And I also don't think we've seen anybody like that since, and we certainly don't have it today with the kind of television that we have these days. But first of all, Jennifer, try and explain to the viewers who Arlene really was, because I don't think, as I said before, we cannot overstate how famous and popular she was at the time, but she was forgotten, really, wasn't she, for quite a number of years?
Well, I hope not, but that probably is so to a degree. And I should note that I did also discover her, of course, I said What's My Line, but on YouTube, because, of course, I had to discover her backwards. I was born in 1984, so about around the time she was wrapping up her career at WOR radio for a time. She had a resurgence, which, of course, Arlene was always sort of coming back, as you say now, even with this book. And I was drawn to the show, but I thought I was drawn to the show. And then I realized, no, I was drawn to Arlene, as you said, because she has that effervescence, and I love the show, but she was the reason that I was drawn to it. And I had written one other book, so I thought, I'm capable of writing a biography, but is one needed, about Arlene? So I looked her up, quick Google search, and I found that there was no biography for her except her own 1978 memoir, which has long been out of print. So I thought, well, let me do it. Let me write one if I can, and let people get reacquainted with this, icon of entertainment, really. So that was in 2019. And I reached out to her.
You started already?
I started in 2019, yes. Oh. I reached out to her son first, Peter Gable, who sadly passed recently. And I wanted to make sure that it would be something that he would approve of, because I didn't want to do it otherwise. And he was very welcoming about it, and we ended up collaborating together a lot during the whole writing process. And sadly, he isn't here to see its release, but he did know that it was going to be released soon. And
yeah, and for people who don't know, Peter Gable actually passed away just a few months ago. We are now in April 2023 recording this, and I think he died. When did he die?
On October 25th.
Oh, was it really that long ago? It seems very present, actually. And
it does.
And I took part in a Zoom conversation. I was watching it where you were on with Peter as well, and a few others who are interested in Arlene. And this was really fascinating. And I wanted to take part in that as well, and to watch it, because I wanted to invite Peter on the show. And I thought, maybe that would be a good time for it. But all of a sudden, somebody's gone, and it's actually quite, well, it was a little bit, terrible that happened, certainly, but how wonderful it was that he collaborated with you, and that he knew so much about your project. And from what I remember from that conversation, he praised you and said how wonderful it was that you were writing this book. So that must also be the most important thing for you, right?
It is, and that's very much why this book is so important, because as he had told me, he really wanted it to be a chronicle of the history of Arlene and certainly her husband, his father, Martin Gable, to go on for future generations, for his son, Sam Gable, and for those who will discover her later. You know, it's important to chronicle that history because Arlene had done so much. And of course, Peter knew that, but even some of the things I found surprised him. And it was kind of interesting that her early life before he was born, because, you know, Peter was born when Arlene was about 40. So she had had an extensive career before he came along. So he didn't really know about some of the early plays and things that she did. So it was really fun for him, I think, to kind of uncover this with me. And certainly he helped fill me in a lot on some of the later years. So we kind of had that balance where it was just a wonderful and very rewarding experience.
Why did he really die? I mean, was it just a shock to everybody? Because it seemed like that he hadn't been sick for a long time. He didn't seem like that.
Well, he had been ill in some recent times. He let me know, but certainly I didn't expect, and I don't think any of us or him expected him to pass, you know, as sudden as he did. But so yes, it was very shocking and very sad. But I am grateful that he knew, and then I believe that he knows that that we've told the story, and now it will stand forever. So Arlene Francis was born in 1907. Yes.
And this is 100 and how many years ago? 15 or something years ago. I mean, it's a long time ago. She saw the beginning of radio and television. And the reason I expected you're writing this is because she was a trailblazer for women, and she was the first woman in all of these fields, and she became so extremely popular with people. I mean, how would you describe her career? Because everybody who really knew her then, I suppose, and also now, they know her as a presenter on television. They know her as an interviewer and a game show panelist. But they really don't know the actress very well. She wasn't known from movies. Maybe if she had become a movie star as well, maybe people would have known her from that work today as well. Like a lot of the other stars that came on the show, What's My Line, as a mystery guest. But please talk about her life as an actress, because from interviews I've seen with her, she says that is the most important thing for her, that's closest to her heart.
It is, and it always has been. And, you know, she started on radio, but she began as a performer on radio. And as you mentioned, she is a presenter as well as a performer. But she started as a performer, and she really wanted to go into the theater right away. But her father was a little reluctant about that, and he wanted to keep her a little bit out of the spotlight. Her grandfather, Albert Davis, her mother's father, had been a Shakespearean actor back in London. So that always excited her, you know, and she would perform for him as a child. She would recite poetry, and he would be sort of her first audience. And I think that really drew her to that field, that she could entertain and that people would appreciate what she did.
So she did have British ancestors, or what?
Yes, on her mother's side, yes. And she did begin performing on radio, and they had little soap operas back then, and that's kind of how our modern day soap operas evolved. Some of them began on radio, I think, as the world turns, or even the ones that we have now in modern days began on radio. So she started there. And her first job, if you will, was interesting because she was to do a bunch of different voices. So she was kind of like a voiceover artist. So she would even do animal sounds. She would do, you know, her voice had sort of a depth to it. Sometimes she would even perform as a man's part in the voice. So that really let her explore and express that medium. And her father was okay with radio. He thought that was a bit more respectable, is what he had said to her. So she wanted his blessing on her early projects, and that's something that she always did. She always preferred to have her parents' approval, even as an adult. And that was something that she noted about herself, and she wasn't sure she liked that about herself later, because she still wanted her parents' approval. And she wanted to be liked so well, and she was. But so she started in radio, and she found her way to the theater eventually, regardless of her father's reluctance, but she did find her way there.
And did her parents finally approve of her as an actress and that path that she went on? I mean, not a lot of people had the career that she had certainly. And from what I've researched about Arlene, she was a workaholic. She worked all the time.
She was.
Even on holidays.
Yes, she had a very strong work ethic, which she got from her father, she explained. And, I know them sure that they were proud of her. And they had to have been. I sometimes think of them watching her on What's My Line. We forget that Arlene was somebody's daughter, that she had proud parents. And of course they attended her premieres. And so we do know that they eventually came to understand that this was where she belonged. But yes, so her first starring role actually came in All That Glitters in 1938. So I think that is when her father realized that, okay, this is going to be something that, that she's meant to do, that she's destined for.
A lot of people say that she was loved so much for personality and the way that she was, her charm, wit, and her appeal, her fun-loving personality, and that warmth that she had, and also the sex appeal, frankly. She was a sexy lady, a sassy lady, and she would say very risque things for that time. I mean, some of the things that she is saying on What's My Line is incredible, considering the age and that time in the 50s, where things were totally different, completely different from today. But she could get away with practically anything because of her personality and that warmth that she has. It's almost like, in a way, I feel that she is present today, that she could be a figure of today. It's like you can relate to that. And I think a lot of people can relate to it. And that's probably why there's still an audience for her, like your book, for example.
Yes, I think so. And it's amazing how the younger generation has responded to her. In fact, Peter told me not too long ago that he receives emails and letters, from people that are just now discovering her on YouTube, as you mentioned, the YouTube channel. And that, I think, is really where this resurgence has come from, and really why I was even able to discover her. And as you know, there's a Facebook group for What's My Line, and that's the companion channel. Was started by a man named Gary Wetstein, and he's responsible for chronicling all those videos for us and putting them in that YouTube channel so that we're able to rediscover them today.
And his remarkable work. This is a piece of history. A lot of people, when they talk about game shows and quiz shows, it's not very respectable and looked down upon a bit. But when you look at What's My Line, this is educational. This is a glimpse into the past, into a distant past that no longer exists. That kind of elegance and the eloquent ways that they presented themselves, and the sophistication and the mannerism and the respect that they had for each other, and the way that they spoke. I mean, it's highly educational for the younger generation today, wouldn't you say?
Yes, it is. And that's one thing I noticed about Arlene on the show. As you said, she had that air of sophistication, the sexiness, but at the same time, she had this familiarity almost, that I think she felt like everyone's friend. And so she wasn't off-putting in the sense that she was elegant and she was sophisticated, but she also drew you to her through her warmth and her, as Peter said, my mother had an incredible ability to transmit love across a television screen. And I think that's so true, because she really radiates this inner glow, if you will. And you may not be able to put your finger on it right away, but people just say, I like her for some reason. She just had that factor, that it factor, I guess you'd call it.
Yeah, you could definitely say that. I mean, certainly from my point of view, I haven't seen anybody like that, not even today. I don't know if there's anybody you can suggest is like that and has that appeal that emanates through the screen today or in recent years.
Well, offhand, I can't think of one, but I'm sure there are many, effervescent type of personalities. But Arlene just had, as her book, her second book was called That Certain Something, and she had that, whatever that is. And she was known for charm, and but she wanted to make sure people knew that she felt that real charm was from the inside, was from being a good person or caring about others. And the book explores that in one of the chapters. I try to get sort of inside of who Arlene was and what her values were, what was close to her heart in terms of charitable work, in terms of what she wanted to contribute. And she was sort of inadvertently a trailblazer for women because she didn't really consider herself a feminist. But as you'll read in the book, there were so many firsts that she accomplished, and she paved so many paths for those like Barbara Walters, of course, who had mentioned Arlene being one of her early mentors. And as a matter of fact, Barbara Walters got started, of course, with the bulk of the height of her fame, or the beginning of her fame, came with the Today Show, which Arlene actually declined. She was offered that first. So that sort of, paved the way for people like Barbara Walters. But when Arlene was asked that once, she said, she downplayed it, of course, and she said, "Oh, Barbara, don't worry about her. She knows how to run a parade." So she would have gotten somewhere without my declining that Today's Show position. But she certainly inadvertently paved the way for so many.
I guess people don't know, women especially, and also men, I suppose. You don't know what kind of inspiration you can be to others when you work and you do your thing, and you go in there and be who you are and work hard at it. And maybe she was one of the first, or the first, maybe, woman on television in that way, and also on radio, but it wasn't a plan, I suppose. So she didn't know she could be called a feminist icon, and maybe she wouldn't, maybe even have liked that. I don't know, because why even call it because she's a woman? Of course, it's more special, but she was so unique. She had such values, and I guess the networks really loved that. That was why she was working across the networks as well, didn't she?
Yes, and that's part of why the book is called All Three Channels, which her grandson names the book. And it's also because, she was on ABC, NBC, and CBS, and those were the three major networks. And she had television shows on all three of them at the same time. So she was doing What's My Line? She was doing something called Soldier Parade. She also had Blind Date, which gave her the distinction of being the first woman to host a game show on television in 1949. So I believe Betty White hosted a similar show in very early 50s. So Arlene kind of just makes it in as being the first woman to host a game show on television. And of course, that show began on radio, and she evolved with the medium, which is important to note. But, once television came about, people got to not only hear her, but see her. And she said for the first time she was getting recognized in public, because before it was just her voice. And they were starting to say, I know, Arlene. And she enjoyed that, actually. She preferred Arlene to Miss Francis with her public, because she felt that it gave that connection and they could feel like she was a friend and one of them. So,
but don't you think in a way that she was a little bit before her time, that she was very modern for the time that era that she was in?
Yes, I think she was, and I think that's part of her appeal today, as you mentioned, because she could be, transported into modern day. I mean, her style and her personality and her ability to say what was on her mind, which back then, of course, wasn't as easy to do. And as you said, she got away with it. She got in trouble a couple times, I think, on it was Blind Date, but not too much trouble that she would be reprimanded, but just that she got people to notice, and I think that's important that she was recognized, because if she was just the same as everyone else, if she didn't say certain things, we wouldn't be remembering her as much as we are.
I like you, Mr. Taylor. You're right on the button with your answers. If it hasn't got strings, can you blow on it? Is there a ringing sound as a result?
Is there a what?
A ringing.
A ringing
Ping,
sound, yes.
ping, ping, ping.
Yeah.
Ringing.
You're demonstrative.
Would there be in any way a bell-like tone
Yes.
connected with this instrument? For example, is there some particular part of the animal that is more interesting to you than other parts of the animal? Yes? Is that part... I was going to say from the waist up, but it sounds so silly.
And the funny thing, I was scared to death. That's what you were going to say.
Is it?
I quit. I don't know where a cow's waist is.
Probably wouldn't interest anybody but a bull. Is it part of
That's quite amazing. And she was allowed to do it in a way because of her personality. I guess if Dorothy Kilgallen, her colleague on What's My Line, if she had done that, it would have been a different story in a way, don't you think? Because she had a different position on that panel.
Yes, I think so. And she just had a different personality, and Arlene had a way of getting something across that it was sort of disarming, and we didn't feel the brunt of it too much. You know, we could laugh along with her and be a bit more playful because that was her natural personality, where it may not have seemed as natural from one of the other panelists. But yes, definitely. And I think that made her a standout, at least to me, and I think to a lot of others as well.
So would you say, and did Peter Gable reveal to you whether or not Arlene was like that in real life? Was she this happy-go-lucky, or just always charming, witty, wonderful, embracing woman in general in her daily life? Or was that something she put on like a mask?
That's a good question, actually. And what Peter told me, what I understand from him, is that she was very much similar to that. So, of course, you know, I expect her to be, you know, making witty remarks at the breakfast table and everyone's laughing. And of course, that was really only 30 minutes on a Sunday night that we saw. But yes, he said she was very much that way, always in good spirits, very good sense of humor. So that was quite natural. And yes, and I think that's good. It made me feel good to know that. And I think a lot of people too, because sometimes we wonder, is this, you know, a persona? But no, it was very much who she was. And of course, we give our best when we're in front of the camera. But she had that carried forward into her personal life as well. So yes.
Yeah, it kind of became an image, and she also, I guess, in a way, had to protect that image because it gave her a lot of work constantly. She was never out of work, as far as I know. I mean, all throughout the years. First, What's My Line from 1950 to 1967, and then the syndicated version that lasted until 1975, I believe. And she was on a lot of other shows as well. I mean, she kept on being a figure that everybody could feel secure about and relate to and wanted to see, and they wanted to open up their television sets and watch that show because of her, right?
Yes, and what was interesting is that because the theater was so important to her, she found the time to incorporate that. And sometimes on What's My Line, you might notice they'll plug one of her plays, or they'll announce her as opening in Once More with Feeling, or, you know, that was so important to her that she kept that up. And even after What's My Line wrapped completely in 1975, she continued to frequent the theater, because I think she felt a little bit like perhaps What's My Line and that place she had held her back a bit from the theater. But the reason that she stayed with the television is because she always had a sense that one day she could be out of work. One day all of this could just disappear. You know, she internally was concerned about that, although she was busy, but she made sure that she was busy because she would accept the offers. And you know, she had this sort of nagging in the back of her head that, you know, this could be the last project. It's not guaranteed. So she really wanted to keep working, and that was important to her. She felt as though if she slowed down, her life would also slow down, and she wanted to make sure that that didn't happen. And I think where that comes from is, as I mentioned, her father had a very strong work ethic, and he was a photographer. I don't know if you know that, specializing in children's portraits. And he became very well known throughout New York. And he didn't know the meaning of retirement, you know, according to Arlene, but eventually he did. And he declined after that. And I think that always stuck with her, that you got to keep going. You know, you have to keep working.
Regrets. Yes, she did regret not being more focused on stage acting. In one sense, she regretted it. In another sense, as you said, television swept her up. You could say the other personality we were addressing swept her up in the early 50s, and she didn't come down from that for a long time, 25 or 30 years from that wave. And television was just coming into the world, and she was able to be a leader of it. And as you say, she didn't make waves, but she had this remarkable job as editor-in-chief of the Home Show, where she was the first boss of that kind, the first woman in charge of a show, in charge of producing the show, in charge of deciding who would be interviewed, what the segments would be, with Hugh Downs as her announcer. That was it took a lot of confidence for her to do that. So it's a mixture. You know, it's a mixture of being for the other and being for herself.
I was mentioning something about her father and actually being a photographer for a very successful one in New York for a time. And before that, he loved to paint. He was also an artist. And Arlene herself actually painted this portrait behind me. I don't know if you can see it too well, but it's a bouquet of flowers.
Oh, yeah, I see it kind of. I mean, there's kind of a reflection or a bit of light there, but I do see it, though. So she could paint well.
Yes, she did. She painted that in 1940 for her father's birthday. And I think she sort of wanted to please him in that sense, because he had sent her to art school early on, I think sort of hoping that she might go that route. But she had a different interest in the arts, performing arts, of course. But yes, she didn't find much time to paint other than that portrait that I know of. And in her later years, when she was struggling with the Alzheimer's disease, she learned to paint with the help of a teacher that I was able to interview for the book. And so that's a very inspirational journey that she took toward the end of her life.
Now, that's very interesting. That's certainly something I don't know anything about, and I'm also looking forward to reading your book eventually. But now, I mean, that's kind of what I would get to eventually, talking about her getting, the Alzheimer's disease. But we can't, now that you touched upon it, you could actually just go into that. That would be okay. When did it actually start? When did she notice that she started to forget? And I know that Peter Gable moved her to San Francisco, didn't he, eventually, or around that area where he was living?
Yes, in 1993. They made that move. But, as Peter said, it was difficult to tell when something like that begins, because it coincided with the passing of her husband, Martin Gable, around the late 80s, so in 1986 and moving forward. So it was hard to tell whether she was just, very consumed with the grief, or whether she was becoming forgetful outside of that as well. But, she continued to work as much as she could. She continued on WOR with Joan Hamburg. They had Luncheon from Sardi's. She was a weekly guest on her show. And I don't know how much the public knew about that. I don't know that it was apparent. But she certainly had an internal struggle that may have been happening for longer than we or she realized. But eventually, as you mentioned, she did make the move to San Francisco to be closer to Peter. And that is where she met with her art teacher, a wonderful woman named Nadine Gay. And she helped her create these sort of abstract collage type of paintings that really gave her a channel of expression and gave her something to do because, Arlene always wanted to be active. And I think that is something that helped her to continue to be productive until the end. But certainly she was always, always active, always had this joyful spirit about her. Even during those times, Peter assured me and her art teacher that she still had that glimmer in her eyes. She still had that essence about her, which I think is remarkable for what she was going through and what she was battling at the time. But
so you think that it could have been triggered by the passing of Martin Gable, her husband, of so many years? I know it was a huge trauma in a way for her to be alone there. I mean, suddenly after being with him, and they have been a couple for so many years, and that certainly maybe could trigger something like that if it's within your personality structure to get Alzheimer's. And it seems like more and more people are getting that today, actually, which is remarkable also. Unfortunately, I mean, and I don't know in those days if they had the right medication for it. Do you know that if she was on medication that could kind of prolong that it got really bad, or was it bad for a long time?
Well, firstly, I don't know that her husband's passing triggered it necessarily, but I think it might have masked what was happening because we could mistake her forgetfulness or differences in her personality for her grief. So I don't know that it triggered it, but I think that it coincided with it and may have masked what was really going on for a time. I'm not certain of her treatments with medication or what they quite had in those days, as you mentioned. But I know she had so many supportive people around her, and Peter made sure of that she always was around familiar people. And of course, Peter, all the time, and her grandson and Peter's partner, Lisa. So she was always very much surrounded by love and care. And I think that's important to someone that's going through those challenges.
But her grandson was born quite late, right? I mean, Peter was kind of rather an old father, wasn't he? So, I mean, did he develop? His name is Sam, I believe.
Yes.
Did he develop a relationship with Arlene, and does he remember his grandmother?
Yes, and that's interesting because he does, and he was quite young when she passed. I believe he was 6. But he has very vivid memories of her because, as I said, they would visit so often. And I chronicle that in the book. I also have an epilogue that is dedicated to Sam. So we'll learn more about his personal journey in the entertainment industry, and also his memories of being with his grandmother in the short but impactful time that they had together.
And Arlene died in 2001, right?
Yes, she did.
And she was 93.
Yes, and as we know, her impact continues to go out, which is why I have a chapter in the book that's sort of dedicated to her legacy, because her legacy didn't really end in 2001, because we're sitting here today, talking about her in 2023. So definitely the remarkable career that she had. And of course we can back up a bit because I know we sort of fast forwarded to sort of the end of her life. But interesting enough is because I actually wrote the book a bit backwards, is that I her art teacher, Nadine Gay, was one of the first interviews that I conducted for the book. So I kind of chronicled her life backwards, and I didn't necessarily write it in the chronological order. So I sort of have, so I sort of have bits and pieces of her life and career, within my mind and ready to speak on. Of course, the book certainly is in chronological order, but just my personal journey, I sort of began at the end. And kind of worked my way forward. And of course, Peter and I had to make time to collaborate with her family tree, going back many generations, with relatives that could help sort of piece together her early existence as well. So
obviously, because this is the whole of the 21st century that she was around basically until the millennium, and this is a fascinating piece of history as well. Also because she saw so much. She was around during the Industrial Revolution and also in the 60s with the Youth Revolution, the feminist movement, and the racist, the racial movement in America and around the world. So she saw a lot of, and that time she was very present on television, even though she was around 60 around that time. I do remember that somebody in that conversation, that mutual conversation that we were on Zoom with Peter, somebody asked him if Arlene liked the modern music, rock and roll and all of that. And do you remember what he said?
I think he said no. And I think some of the viewers were quite disappointed because Arlene seemed like she could be really with the times. But I know she loved, as far as I know, the old standards like Frank Sinatra and, those greats of her generation. And she really felt that she had to get a little bit modernized with the syndicated version of What's My Line. Because that did take a different, the occupations were certainly different. As many of you know, What's My Line, they had to guess the the contestant's occupation. So they were very different. They went from, being governors in the 1950s and being secretaries to being, Playmate of the Year, or, things that Arlene might take us to think, oh my gosh, So they were a little more risque, some of the occupations, of course, and that was to add a little fun and to the modern changing times. But I think she handled it all very well. And
she kept on seeming, she seemed modern also at that point, even though she was almost approaching 70, which nobody could tell because she was still very hip and happy. And when you watch it, it's always her taking center stage in a way, right? You're kind of waiting until it's her turn.
It is. And it's interesting you mentioned that her age which she didn't like to discuss her age, but during the syndicated show when she was, getting somewhat older, and Martin Gable was a mystery guest once, and of course she caught on right away, to him, and they asked him a question during the afterward segment saying, would he ever like to be a panelist, and he said no, because it's a young show. And I'm thinking, Arlene isn't really young right now, but it's like everyone saw her as being, very with the times, and she could move, with a young show and a young crowd. So we just saw her that way naturally, and I think that's why she was so timeless.
Yeah, exactly.
And she remains so.
So, some people say that she wasn't necessarily, and this is an interesting area to get into in a way, and I think you can certainly explain a lot about that. But some people apparently didn't see her as a very renowned or great actress. Is that true? Or and some really did say that she was a very wonderful actress who had a lot of variety to her talent. She could play a lot of different things, but she did have some great successes on Broadway, but she also had some flops, and some of the shows only lasted a month or a few weeks or something. Can you explain a little bit about this?
Yes, I will actually. And what I found, not only in watching what I could see of her work, but reading so many reviews, which is really where I can really get the essence of what happened, is that she was very much praised as an actress, but the plays that she was in didn't have good reviews. So in other words, she was a standout, but the play itself was not always successful. But reviewers did always note her talent, and oftentimes they'll say that, she made the play what it was, or she carried it with an essence of elegance. And so she herself did get very good reviews for her acting work, but it's just that the vehicles that she was in sometimes were not very successful. And I think that possibly why is because she was so very much wanting to work, and she wanted to take what was offered. So maybe she wasn't as selective as she could have been, because she always wanted to make sure that she had that next job, And it certainly did keep her in the public eye. I think she would have preferred to have more success on the stage, but she had glowing reviews, I know, in Once More Was Feeling and Mrs. Dally Has a Lover. So many that she really got, even some of her regional performances, very, very glowing reviews for her performance. And the cast, of course, was very well, I'm sure. But what I'm saying is that compared to the success, or say the failure of the play, was not always equal to her success as far as the performance that she gave. So that's what I think really sort of explains the reason.
Do you think that the public, I mean, this is speculation, but maybe you have some insight to this or knowledge about it in your research doing the book. But I mean, do you think that people couldn't deal with seeing her on the stage? I mean, probably they wanted to see her on the stage because they knew her from television, but it was almost like it had to be her in a way. I don't know if that's how it was, but I mean, sometimes when somebody's really popular on television and you feel like it's family in a way, then, to go and see a play with somebody, it could be a little bit unfamiliar to a lot of people. That's just my thoughts and speculation. I don't know if there's any truth in that.
Yes, no, it's a good point. And she mentioned something similar, that she was known so well for playing herself in a way, because, as you said, people did become familiar with her. And I think the difference between her success on television and the success of many other performers is that she wasn't playing a role. So we're not falling in love, essentially, with Lucy Ricardo or Edith Bunker. We're falling in love with actually Arlene Francis, who she is in real time. And at least that's how we were perceiving that this was really her. And of course, we know now through Peter that it was, basically really who she was. But so, yeah, you're right. I mean, we were connecting with her, and I think she understood that. Like she said, she played herself for so long that, it was difficult maybe for people to enjoy her as much. And I don't think that she would have achieved as much success, which I told Peter once, and I believe he was in agreement. But if she had become this huge movie star, she wouldn't have been as beloved for who she was, because we got to see her, not different characters that she played, but it was really her that we were drawn to. So I think that's actually became an important part of her success, the fact that she wasn't as well known for characters as she was for simply being Arlene Francis.
Which is also amazing, because it can be very difficult to play all fields or to work all three channels, as
right.
The name of your book. And I guess it could confuse a lot of people, especially in America. I think it's different here in Europe, actually, in terms of overlapping, that a lot of actors here in my country and Europe, and also in England, actually, they can be in the theater, and they can be in movies, and they can be on television. It's not looked down upon being on television. You can still go in and be a box office movie star in England, for example, apparently. Where in America, it seems like I shouldn't say segregated, but it's separated. It's like it's different fields and different people belong to that field. Maybe you cross over like Angela Lansbury did in Murder, She Wrote, and she became a popular TV star. But she had been a movie star and on the stage, obviously, in musicals and all of that. So, I mean,
Yes.
it's like you can't work all three fields like what Arlene did.
Yes, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I interviewed a woman named Jackie Sanders who created the first documentary film about Arlene, which I hope will be available at some point for all of us to enjoy. But she noted how, Arlene did everything. She did it all. She did the broadcasting. She did the acting work. She did so much, and she wasn't just relegated to this one specific area, And that film is called That Certain Something, and which, of course, Arlene had. And
We would
yes,
love
she
to
was
see
able.
that. We would love to see that, huh?
Yes, for sure. And so I want to make sure to mention that, because I'm hoping possibly if someone can hear it and can do something about getting it out there for all of us to enjoy, because Arlene did do so much. And that's why I hope that this book can be a part of her continued legacy, that someone can find this. When I discovered her, I couldn't believe that I had lived all of these years at the same time that she was alive, and I had no idea that she even existed, because there's so much energy, there's so much, to her, that you want to know someone like that. And if you can't know someone like that, you want to know about them. And I thought, what could I do for her?
Yeah, I have the same thing. I never knew she existed, and a lot of people don't, and probably there's a lot of people who still don't know unless they've seen What's My Line and some of the other shows that is available. I mean, this is a fascinating thing, that you can be that popular and you can be that known, that famous. She couldn't walk down the street, right, without somebody knowing her face and her voice. And then suddenly new generations come and you just kind of disappear and nobody knows who you are, unless it like Betty White, you have a resurrection in a way, right? Which was also unusual. That had probably never happened before in that way, I would expect.
Yes, for sure. And I know Betty White, I've seen a few interviews with her, and because a lot of people, she was such a pioneer too. And I think she gets a lot of that credit, which she deserves. But sometimes I notice that she'll take a step back and she'll say, Arlene Francis came before me in some areas. So, she's was always glad to give Arlene that due as well, because again, which is part of the All Three Channels, is that she was, a trailblazer for women on television. She was an actress, and she did so many different things in so many different mediums.
But
so
do you think that, Jennifer, do you think that if somebody came today and became a popular interviewer, or if Barbara Walters had been an actress, do you think people could relate to going to see her shows on Broadway? I mean, it is rather unusual that she was able to do all of that work simultaneously, in a way. Huh? It really has been done a lot.
Yes, and I think possibly because she did it alongside she did everything together, in a sense that, in other words, she didn't go for 20 years as strictly a broadcaster and then decided to do a play. She did it sort of, as you say, simultaneously, sort of all together. So we knew very much that she was a stage actress. We also knew that she was on game shows. She managed to do it at the same time. And I think that's why we, were able to grasp it and to accept it, because it wasn't sort of unusual or out of her realm, because she was essentially doing all of it. On off seasons of What's My Line, she would do plays, or she took a break once to film 1, 2, 3 in Germany in 1961, the Billy Wilder film. And then she did The Thrill of It All, directed by Carl Reiner in 1963, where she traveled back and forth between Los Angeles and New York to do What's My Line on Sunday nights. So she always made room as much as she could for the work that she felt was important to her career.
Why do you think she was offered so few movie roles?
Yes, it's probably because of what you say, that we're so used to seeing her. She's so associated with What's My Line. And in fact, in the film 1, 2, 3, there's a bit of a famous scene where they reference a common saying on What's My Line, where they'll call for a conference. Sometimes the panelists did that when they wanted to discuss who they thought the mystery guest was, or the occupation of the regular guest. So they used it a little bit in the film, even to remind people of, maybe not so much remind them, but just pay a little homage to it and sort of give it that little wink of like, okay, this is What's My Line. This is that person from What's My Line who's also in this movie. And that may have been why. But also, Arlene loved the stage, and she said, I'm not really a film actress, and possibly she didn't want to take as many of those roles. But there's little, those films were quite successful for their day. I mean, they weren't huge films, but they also weren't, they were fairly successful. And even one of her earliest films, called With These Hands, which was a documentary style, chronicling the Great Depression and the fire in the women's shirtwaist factory, and very dramatic plot there. But actually, that film, as obscure as it probably is now, was nominated for an Oscar. So we don't realize that she was in some substantial things. I mean, I know that one of the news media outlets said that she'd managed to build her career on a steady succession of flops. And in a way, it was sort of a backhanded compliment, but she was able to do it because she was good, she was talented, and people wanted to see what she was in.
And didn't she also, very early in her career, appear with Boris Karloff in a Dracula movie or Frankenstein or whatever it was? It was some of those early horror films, right?
Yes, that was her first actual film role, Murders in the Rue Morgue. Yes, where she played sort of just this, she didn't have very much of a speaking role at all. Maybe she just gave a scream or something, but it was something she kind of did unbeknownst to her father, who was not quite pleased by her role in that film. But she had taken a vacation with her mother to Los Angeles and inadvertently got to meet with David Selznick and got her into a small role in this picture. And of course, when her father found out about it, because it opened at Lowe's Theater in New York, and he had no idea, films opened quickly then. It wasn't like we had to wait now for so long before they would come out. But so she sort of took a step back after that, but it gave her the exposure, and she found time to do some plays when she was out here, which is amazing. She did a very early obscure play at a theater here in LA when she was out here doing her very first film, and she was basically an unknown. But
wow.
She'd attended the Theater Guild, and she had experience and she had talent, so it worked for her.
Well, she certainly wasn't associated with Los Angeles or Hollywood in that way. She was very New York, the upper class New York, with this mid-Atlantic accent. I think she was putting on a lot, which was kind of a movie star accent, and kind of slightly British in a way. I think she gravitated a lot to the British. It seemed that way, but now you're telling me that she had British ancestors and family. But I mean, it's like she was very classy in that way. That was how she presented herself, and that it's like it's a different breed of those old times New York high society people of that era, right? And she was part of that.
Yes, she was, and she was like one of her producers in the 1980s. She did a show called Prime of Your Life, sort of highlighting those in their golden years, which is where she was about. So she was a good fit to host that program. And I spoke with one of her producers, Chris Salvador, and he remarked on just how fascinated he was by her mannerisms, by her voice, such a refined way about her that he didn't feel was forced or phony, but that it was just so naturally exuded from her. And I think that's, again, we just accepted everything from Arlene because it did seem so natural, and much of it was, but, the elegant way that she spoke and her gestures. And I think it came across as very much natural.
Yeah, they can certainly learn a lot from that today, huh?
Yes. Yeah, she had, I wonder what, sometimes what, we say that Arlene is so popular in this day and age, in a sense. And I wonder how she would handle that, with social media and things that she never even dreamed would be in the YouTube that she is so much a part of with What's My Line. And, she says at one point in her book that she said, who knows, maybe somewhere an episode of What's My Line is airing somewhere on television. And now to imagine that it's on demand 24 hours a day on something called YouTube, she probably can't even fathom that, something that she was a part of is able to live on for such a long time.
Yeah, if you could time travel back to the early 60s or late 50s or something and tell all of them how this is popular today and how they have gotten a renaissance in a way, with a lot of people, a lot of new audiences also across the ocean here. I mean, we're talking from around the world. I mean, we couldn't be further apart, really. I'm in Copenhagen, you're in Los Angeles, and a lot of people are starting to really realize what a fascinating piece of history and how educational that show was, even though it was a game show, but how you really learn a lot. Also about language, about history, about the people that was the movers and shakers of that time. And also we have to say that Arlene has interviewed everybody really, and all of those movers and shakers and presidents and public speakers, politicians, you name it. I guess she interviewed all of them, right? In that back in the past.
Oh, yes. She, like I said, she was on WR radio for 25 years as a talk show host with the Arlene Francis show. So she interviewed Dr. Martin Luther King in the 60s. She interviewed so many people that made such an impact. And even going back before then, she interviewed some of the survivors of the Andrea Doria shipwreck. She's connected to so much history in the sort of web of a time capsule that she really captured. I wish more of those interviews were readily available. I'm sure they do exist in some archives, but even on her home show she had in the 1950s, a show called Home, she interviewed Kennedy. This was before he was actually president, and Jacqueline Kennedy as well. So just so many people that she ended up interviewing, and we have, some of them are available to see, but it's fascinating the scope of that she interviewed, the people that she was able to talk to, and the ease with which she put people. And I think she listened well too, and I think that's a hallmark of a good interviewer, as you well know, I'm sure. But
yes, absolutely. And it's wonderful to listen to some of those shows that are available. I also wish that more was available because she's a wonderful inspiration. I'm thinking about the panel on What's My Line. I mean, she was close to Bennett Cerf. That's what we hear,
yes.
At least. But I guess he was the one that she was closest to, right? She wasn't. I don't know how close she was with Dorothy Kilgallen or with John Daly.
Well, as far as I know, definitely her and Bennett Cerf and his wife, Phyllis Cerf, they were very close. They had homes very close by in Mount Kisco, New York, which Arlene sort of used as a summer home. And, of course, Bennett's son, Jonathan, was very close friends with Peter, so they grew up together. And some of you have seen Jonathan's speech at Peter's memorial recently, but so definitely they were the most friendly outside of the show. But I do very much feel that they had a mutual respect amongst all of them, and especially Dorothy Kilgallen. I have some wonderful quotes from her that I found for the book that, Dorothy was a journalist, so she had to be very forthright about what she thought and reviews of plays that she'd seen, but she very much made it known the respect that she had for Arlene. And, she said if I didn't like a play that she was in, I just simply wouldn't say, rather than give her a poor review. So I thought that spoke volumes of the respect that Dorothy had for Arlene, and I know it was certainly mutual.
And normally she wouldn't shy away of speaking
Right.
in her columns, Dorothy, right?
Exactly.
That's what we hear. So I guess they were kind of sisters in that way, being on the show and having a great.
They supported each other, yes, in their separate endeavors, but they both knew what it was like to be in the public eye, and I'm sure that they wanted to support each other as much as they could.
Do you know anything about how Arlene felt after this mysterious death of Dorothy Kilgallen? Obviously, this has, a lot of people are speculating what actually took place, and things doesn't really amount to. I mean, there's something very suspicious about the way that she suddenly died there in 1965. And there's a lawyer, Mark Shaw, I believe, who's investigating and want to open up the investigation. And he's had a lot of trouble doing that because he wants justice for Dorothy Kilgallen. Do you know anything about how Arlene felt about her death? Because we haven't really heard what she said. Maybe she was asked not to speak. I don't know if you know about any of that.
Yes, that's a question that I get asked a lot. And, Arlene said very, very little, if anything, about Dorothy's death, which I did find interesting. Perhaps she felt it wasn't her place to speak on it or didn't want to. In her memoir, in fact, she doesn't go into that at all. So I think it's very purposeful for a reason. But just thinking back to some of my own research, there's at least one episode of What's My Line where toward the end of the series, well, not the end of the series, but toward Dorothy's run toward the end of her life there, she had taken some leave from the show. It may have been personal issues. I believe she was ill. And Arlene expressed concern about that. Dorothy was a mystery guest. She kind of surprised them to say, I'm back. After a long absence, Dorothy had been the mystery guest. And when Arlene takes her blindfold off, she says, I've been so worried about you. There may have been some personal concerns. I also read one newspaper story where Arlene had mentioned calling Dorothy's home a few times and either not getting an answer or not having a call back. So I think there was a concern about her leading up to that time. But as far as why she died or anything like that, I have no idea where Arlene stood on her thoughts about that. But she was certainly shaken by it, as was the entire panel when they spoke on it, the show following her death. So I would say there was a concern from what I understand, but she spoke so little about her feelings or thoughts on it.
And maybe there's a reason for that, and that is probably understandable, especially if they were all told not to talk about it. I mean, that is a bit suspicious in itself. So it's interesting that people are also looking into what went on with Dorothy, because this is also another thing that happens when a new generation is discovering those people on the panel, because she was also forgotten basically, and you couldn't be more famous than her as well at that time.
Right, and that's why I also think that it's sometimes a shame that Dorothy is maybe better remembered now for her death than her life and accomplishments. So I'm hoping that we can remember her for the great work that she did in journalism as well. And of course, we'll never lose that, allure would be the wrong word, but the intrigue surrounding what happened to this brilliant woman. Of course, and it certainly deserves to be explored. But I hope that we can also remember the many accomplishments that she did as well. And she made the show what it was also because, you had to have that balance among the panel. So if we only had Arlene or we only had Dorothy or we only had Bennett serve, we needed them to be so distinct and different and complement each other as well as they did. And of course, John Daly was the perfect host to sort of moderate that whole thing and navigate it as well as he did. And he was very accomplished in other, as far as being a journalist as well. I'm sure you know that, but this was also just part of their lives, such a small part, really, that some of us now just think about associated with What's My Line. But this was just taking a half hour. It was a live show, so they just took this half hour a week to gather together, and then they went ahead and did all of their respective work in so many other fields.
I guess maybe because you can see this massive amount of shows there. I mean, there's so many. You can binge watch all of that and still find some new shows you haven't seen, maybe. And that's probably why people think that I think it's an overload, really, of shows that really it gives you the impression that that is what they mainly did, and that's far from the truth.
Yes, exactly. And one thing that I'm sure Arlene, saved much memorabilia and notices from her career, but in preparation for some of the research and photographs for the book, her son Peter Gable loaned me this huge lot of archives and things that Arlene had kept for many years. And as I sorted through them in this particular case that is just massive that he gave me, I didn't find one article or one notice about What's My Line. She had all of her play reviews, and Martin Gable had a wonderful scrapbook that he made of all of his reviews. So you could see where their heart was, the theater, really, and the family photos. But I didn't find one remnant of What's My Line. She may have had a separate source for that, a separate, where she kept that memorabilia. But from what I saw, I couldn't find any of it. And I thought, well, I think that shows that what she wanted to savor, what she wanted to open up and look back on was her stage career and her family.
Yeah.
And not to say she wasn't proud of the show, because she certainly was, but I think that the public maybe appreciated its impact more. She maybe didn't even realize how much of an impact it has made. Probably,
and certainly also today, where we only basically have that to know them and know her from.
Right, exactly.
So, I mean, her life wasn't always just a bed of roses and her being happy and cheerful and great to other people. She also had some ups and downs, right? And she, there was this incident, I'm sure you go into that in the book, that we've heard quite a lot about, where I think a thing or a statue fell out of her window and killed a bystander, a woman passing by underneath her window.
Yes, very unfortunate. Yes, Arlene was away doing a play, I believe, and she was having some construction work, renovation work done on her apartment in New York. And I believe a sort of what she used to lift weights, either a barbell or a small dumbbell, as it's called, was placed in a windowsill because she had had the air conditioner removed, so they were trying to cover this window space and had used that, unfortunately, to hold a towel and cover. Well, of course, what happened is that it fell from the window just as a man was exiting a restaurant underneath her apartment, and he was killed, unfortunately. And that was put a damper on her personally. I mean, of course, she probably got negative publicity for the first time in her career, and it wasn't her fault, essentially. She wasn't even home, but it carried with her, it stayed with her. The responsibility that she felt, even though she knew that there was nothing she could have done, but she felt somehow the weight of that throughout her life. And then with the subsequent car accident that she was in, which you probably know about as well, which happened, very close together. And I think that was also within the same decade, very crushing, where a woman was also killed in that accident.
Yeah, I think I got it mixed up. I thought it was a woman who was killed by that thing falling out of her window, but it was actually the car accident, right? That a woman died. Yeah, please address that also. I think it's important to talk about as well.
Yes, it was very devastating for her, and it put her into a place where maybe for the first time that she speaks of, went into a severe depression because, again, of the loss of life and the weight of it, that the connection that she had to it, unfortunately. And as Peter once referenced, he remembers shortly after the incident, I believe it was the first accident with the falling of the barbell, they went to their Mount Kisco home, where they would spend weekends sometimes, to give Peter sort of that regular life aside from the glitz of New York. So he remembers walking by her bedroom door and just hearing her sobbing. She just maybe she didn't want him to see that, because he certainly rarely saw that side of her, but he heard it, and he knew, the pain that she was carrying, and the weight of those losses that really did stay with her, she said, for her whole life. And even as she chronicled them in her memoir, she said that she had to just write the words, but that she couldn't really attach the emotion because it was just too much. It's
also a truly strange coincidence and a very unfortunate one. What are the odds, really, that there were two accidents where she was involved, and, well, not involved, but associated with, obviously, where two people died?
Exactly. Yeah, that was probably the two things that are shadows on her memory, I guess, and not that it takes anything away from her, but it's just that we associate her with so much light and happiness. But she did have, she was associated with trying times, and that's, I think, one of the most surprising things about her life, is that it wasn't always perfect. And of course, toward the end of her life, she had to endure her own tragedies that were personal to what she had to walk through, in the sense of the Alzheimer's. And so certainly it wasn't always as wonderful as we see it. And of course, no one's life is, but she once said, or a friend of hers had said, that Arlene acts as though life was the best party that she'd ever attended. And I think for many years, that could be somewhat true, but Peter wanted people to know that she was just a regular person, that she didn't just because she was famous, that she didn't have a life that was better, or that she was worthy of more, that she was really like everyone else and tried to live her life the best she could, and she just had extraordinary talents, and we all got to enjoy them.
Yes, certainly. And she was also married before she got married to Martin Gable, right? And it took her quite some time to get divorced. She didn't really want to get divorced, so she was afraid of filing for divorce from that first husband, right?
Yeah, she was married to Neil Agnew for 10 years. And of course, during that time, she met Martin, and she knew then that, it was inevitable that she must go through with the divorce. But, Arlene didn't like to make waves, and I think she wanted to keep everything as smooth as possible. But at the same time, she knew that she was, not being true to herself, because this is not what she wanted any longer. And so she had to finally did file for divorce and sort of make that break. But she thought that, she didn't want to hurt her husband. She loved him in the sense of they had a mutual respect, and she makes that very clear, of course, and she doesn't say, one negative word about him, and I don't think that was any reason for their divorce. It was just that she personally wasn't fulfilled. But it was kind of funny, because she said once she finally did go through with the divorce, her first husband was much more understanding than she hoped, or than she expected. She thought he might, just go to pieces over it, but he maybe understood that it was coming. He maybe felt that she was unhappy, but she thought he would be much more outwardly crushed by it. But at the same time, it might have made things a little bit easier that he was willing to just let her go. And of course, Martin and her, stayed married until the end, and they had a very, long and wonderful relationship together, as we know.
And actually, it's interesting to ask you if you know if their relationship was as it seemed, because she seemed really happy. He also seemed happy. It must have been great for Peter and now for the family to have so many shows and so many videos now of both parents, because Martin Gable was so often a guest panelist, and a very great one as well, on the show there. So they were together, but I mean, they seemed really tight and happy, and had a fun rapport also on the show. He wasn't, I mean, from a superficial point of view, he wasn't what you might term a really gorgeous Hollywood type actor in that way, and she seemed to flirt a lot with the guests that were on. But I mean, he was a strong character and a great actor, wasn't he?
He was. He actually is a Tony winning actor. He won for Big Fish, Little Fish in 1961. I believe, for his role in that film. So yes, and she was very drawn to his voice, as I think many people were. He had such a wonderful resonant voice. And a lot of his younger publicity shots, you know, he was very debonair, and he did have really this allure that I can understand that she was attracted to, you know, and I think, you know, he was handsome, of course, in a way that he had his own way about him, you know, his own presence, you know, whether that was textbook to someone else, you know, but I think he certainly had very charming qualities, as did Arlene. And they had a mutual respect, I think, too, which kept their relationship together because, you know, they weren't competitive, and Martin made that very clear, because they were in the same field, essentially, but they celebrated each other's accomplishments. I wish they had appeared together more as far as stage roles. They did do a few. But yes, I think their relationship was really built on mutual respect. And Arlene she leaned on him a bit in terms of he was very cultured and he knew he was so knowledgeable, and she felt he was a little above her in that sense when they first met. But as Martin would go on to say, she surpassed him and she became very worldly, and she had to learn so much about people from her radio show. But she'd fall back on him if she didn't know something. You know, she would go to him still and say, you know, can you help me understand this? Or so they had this mutual respect, and they weren't trying to one-up each other at all. In fact, interestingly, in the 1950s, when Arlene thought that she needed to learn a little bit more about the ways of the world, and she thought Martin knew more than her, so she took some courses, some night courses in world relations, and also so that she could actually educate herself, so that her and Martin could have more dynamic conversations. Actually, she was so dedicated to that she would even take some night courses on top of, if you can even imagine her schedule in the 1950s, that she would do that particularly and to strengthen her conversations with her husband, I mean, is quite remarkable too. So they worked at it, you know, and they ended up staying together for all those years.
That's quite amazing, though, isn't it? Yeah, that's very, very good. More people should do that today. I mean, and certainly in that field, in the acting field, you know, if actors meet and get married, they don't last very long. There's only a few, I think. So they were quite lucky and seemed to be very happy as well. Do you know if Arlene had, do you know anything about if she had any affairs? I mean, not while she was married necessarily. That's not what I'm asking. But I mean, in her life, if there were other men than those two that she was married to, because she did always seem like a flirt. You also see on What's My Line. I mean, she would take any opportunity if a good-looking guy came in there, she would say something, right?
Yes. Well, the only other man that she spoke of as far as a serious relationship would be with the band leader, Johnny Green, in the early 1930s. And they got together then, and, you know, she had fun, I think she said, and she liked, you know, going out on the town with him and listening to his band play and him giving her loving looks during the sets. And they enjoyed each other, but they mutually parted ways. And that was shortly before she married her first husband. So, and Johnny Green ended up being an creating Oscar-winning scores for many films. But, you know, where I think she might have met him is he would do, back in the old days, the radio shows had live orchestras, and he was very likely conducting music for one of the many radio shows that she was a part of. Mm. So that's really the only other serious relationship that she mentions.
That's also interesting in a way. Yeah. Also quite different from today. That's, unless she doesn't speak of any other, but I mean, it's interesting, certainly. Do you think, going back to her fame for being her, that, for example, she could have landed a big sitcom or a long-running TV show like All in the Family or something like Gene Stapleton, for example, did? But maybe that again would have been something that some of these producers wouldn't put her in because she was so famous for being her. Is that again something that you think is that because she was already on television, so it would have been natural for her to have a long-running TV show, which she could have had in the 70s as well.
Yes, it's interesting. I believe in the 60s there was talk of, I think someone had approached her for a similar concept, but that never materialized, and I'm not 100% clear on the particulars of that, but it does ring a bell, because it certainly does seem like she would be a good fit for something like that. But again, it didn't materialize for whatever reason, if it indeed was a viable prospect. But certainly she did it all, and she could have probably done more, even though we can't imagine that she'd have time to do it.
Definitely not. Why did this spark your interest? What's just briefly, your background? I mean, why write a book about Arlene Francis, a cultural figure of the past?
Yes, well, I had written one other book about Joan Crawford. It's called Joan Crawford, A Talent for Living. I wrote that was published in 2018.
Oh, wow. So, that's quite a character as well.
Yes. And so I've always enjoyed sort of looking back at these figures of the past, and sort of, Joan Crawford, certainly many books written about her, but I thought I needed to give it a different treatment in my book. And then with Arlene, I honestly only knew of What's My Line because Joan Crawford had been, I believe, a 4-time mystery guest. And I didn't pay much attention to anyone but Joan because I was studying her. I was fascinated with her. But then when I watched the show again, just random mystery guests and people that I wasn't so fascinated with, I began gravitating toward the panelists and looking at them. And Arlene soon became someone that was so interesting to watch that I just felt I had to find out more about her. And when I did, I thought, I said I wouldn't write another book because I have to feel passionate about the subject. And I began to feel very passionate about Arlene, and I thought, well, she deserves to be remembered in this way, and to have at least a chronicle of everything she did in one place, at least everything I could find that she did. So that's kind of what led me there, and the reason that I wrote it.
That's very, very fascinating. Do you have any secret things or something you can tell us about Arlene here in our remaining moments?
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know. Arlene was very much, her life consisted so much of working, and I do in the book, I try to, alongside all of her accomplishments, kind of give you little inside looks into who she was. But I don't know that she had any really big secrets, which is part of why I think some people might think, oh, a book about Arlene Francis, we're not going to get all the, what are we really going to find out? But I think that there are things to find out, because they don't always have to be negative, to be interesting. And she certainly was very interesting for all that she did. And I'm sure in the pages, somebody will find little things they didn't know, and I'm sure they're in here, but I can't think offhand of one that stands out that I can share universally. But she was full of surprises. I mean, you never knew what she was going to say or what she was going to do, So her life is equally that way.
And people can certainly watch that if they watch What's My Line, or even Password, or some of the I've Got a Secret. She's on a lot of those game shows there that you can watch on YouTube. And I think there's even a couple of episodes of the Home Show that she did, and a few other things that people can watch if they want to see her more and learn more about her and see what we're talking about here. So, and in a moment before you tell people how they can purchase the book, please talk about something that always followed Arlene until it was stolen, her heart necklace.
Yes, that actually, there were two versions of it. And I think that some of the people that watch very closely on What's My Line will notice.
Oh.
And I want to say 3 versions, but there were 2 necklaces. So Martin Gable gave her the diamond heart pendant on their first wedding anniversary. And later, maybe it may have been their 10-year anniversary. I think Peter was maybe 8 or 10 at the time. If you'll notice, there's added a little tiny diamond heart, a diamond inside of the heart. So in the beginning, it's just a plain heart. Then they add a little diamond to it. there's a very kind of cute, sweet story as to why that's there, which I'll kind of leave people in suspense to find out, because I never knew why that was there, but you find out in the book. And then later, in the 60s, she has more of it's a larger pendant. I don't know why that changed. Maybe Martin sort of upgraded it for one of their milestone anniversaries or something, but it was that larger pendant, the one she wore in later years, that was stolen, just callously ripped from her neck as she walked down a New York street one day. It was never recovered, and I don't think she ever recovered from that. She was very shaken, of course, when it happened. And I don't know if you know, but there's a famed New York designer, and I want to get his right, by the name of Hess, Jake Hess, I believe. And he found out about this terrible incident of her necklace being stolen, and I think everyone just felt for her, if we could return it to her, we would in some way. So what he did was he made a replica, and he invited her to a public luncheon where he presented it to her. And he actually designed one of the rings that I'm wearing. I just purchased it just as a little memento. But so he actually sort of gave the heart back to her in the way that he could. And I've only seen photos from that luncheon where he presented the necklace to her, but she was very moved, visibly moved by it. So it came back to her in a sense, a sweet gesture from a very kind man and famed jeweler. And
wow, that's a very interesting story. I didn't know that. That was a wonderful thing to do, right? I mean, it must also have been quite traumatic, but she was known for that necklace, always wearing it throughout the decades, always. And then suddenly for somebody to rip it off her neck as she's walking down the street. I mean, it's also a symbol of her life with Martin. And then he had died, it must have been another trauma in a way, also spiritually, that's what I'm thinking.
It was, yes. And I believe it was Jose Hess who was the jeweler. And if I've got his name wrong, I apologize. But it was so very kind of him to do that, because as you said, it was sort of, as she said, in an interview following that, she said, Martin's gone, because at that time he had passed. And she said, and now the necklace is also gone. So that was kind of like a tangible connection to him. That she wore it, and she really did never take it off, except a couple times to have it clean by the jewelers or fixed. And sometimes you'll look and it doesn't appear as though she's wearing it, but she would drop it on a longer chain. Sometimes when she couldn't wear it in a film or on stage, so she's always wearing it somewhere. Or sometimes she would turn it over and just have the chain show, and you can sometimes see it in the back a little bit. So it meant a lot to her that even if it didn't fit with maybe her whatever she was wearing, or she found a way to keep it.
She had to have it on.
Yes.
Wow,
it was almost like her superpower in a sense, because once it was taken, inevitably and coincidentally, she began to decline as well.
That is a very interesting, thing you're saying there. It does really make sense, and it's very interesting, and it's a fascinating life. It's a fascinating story, and certainly a fascinating and delightful, as they always call her, a delightful star, and she is something that we can enjoy now on YouTube still, and people can really enjoy reading your book, all 3 channels. And how can they purchase the book? How can they get a hold of it?
Well, they can purchase it directly from Bear Manor Media, which is my publisher. It's also available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble online retailers as well, I believe. So certainly anywhere where books are readily available, they should have it, or at least be able to order it for you.
And people can also order it overseas here, for example?
As far as I know, through Amazon, I think does have an international website. So you would probably know better as far as Europe. But it will also be available on May 1st in a Kindle ebook edition, if some people rather read it that way.
Oh.
So right now it's in paperback and hardcover. I certainly do hope it's available internationally, at least through Amazon.
So there'll be a Kindle, and how about an audiobook? Have you considered that?
Yes, actually, I believe there will be a forthcoming audiobook, and I'm not sure who will be the narrator. But it's going to be something in the future. I'm fairly certain of that.
And do you have a website or anything that people can look at? Or
that's interesting. Not particularly for Arlene. I have some, of course. I have a Joan Crawford Instagram, For the Love of Joan Crawford, which I post about Arlene, about myself, and about Joan as well. So you can find me there if you want to find some, little behind the scenes tidbits about either the book or my other book, or just about me in general. You can find it at For the Love of Joan Crawford on Instagram.
Great. And
I'm a part of the What's My Line Facebook group, obviously. So anyone from that group can easily contact me there, or on Facebook at my personal profile.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And are you planning on writing any other book in the future?
Well, at the moment, no, because I always seem to say that after every book that, that they take a lot of work, and it has to be a subject that I'm very passionate about. So if that were to happen, then possibly, but there are no current plans.
Wonderful. I just hope that you'll have all the success in the world with this new book about Arlene Francis, all 3 channels, and I wish you the best of luck. And I want to thank you so much for being on with me today. It was wonderful to get to know a little bit more about Arlene and going back to the very significant and interesting past that we can enjoy on YouTube. So thank you, Jennifer Bitman, for being on with me.
Thank you so much for a very in-depth look at a wonderful and delightful star. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, really, for taking the time, and as much time as you took with the interview. And I really do appreciate it.
Arlene is a most remarkable person. It seems to me that every year passing you get lovelier, not only just physically, but also in the wonderful kind of woman you are.
Pleasure.
You could say one of the biggest stars of all ought to get up and take a special bow.
I think that's a good idea. One of the biggest stars of all should stand up.
Thank you so much to Jennifer Bitman for being on my show, The Lucas Alexander Show. And I want to thank all of you for watching. Please like and subscribe to my channel. And I hope to see you again soon.